morning I want to take a first-person approach to the sermon as we look at the third sign from John's Gospel. Let's just pray briefly. Lord, I would pray this morning that you'll open our hearts to be pricked again by your word, to see how it can speak to us in our day, in our place, in spite of all the distance and all the difference in culture, how your word is eternal. In Jesus' holy name, amen. Well, as the disciple whom Jesus loved, following this man from Galilee was an adventure of a lifetime, I've got to tell you. Of course, it wasn't for the faint of heart, because while it was exciting, it seemed like we were always embroiled in controversy. That is John and myself as John and Peter and the rest of the disciples as we walked along with Jesus. Now, to appreciate the story that I have written here in this gospel, the Gospel of John that the people later called it, I want you to remember what has happened so far, and remember what I wrote there at the end of my gospel in John chapter 20 and verse 30 and 31, that Jesus had performed many, many other signs in the presence of his disciples. But I've tried to pick a few of them. And I've picked them for a certain intention. I put them together in this book, not in a chronological way, but in a way to make a statement about who Jesus is, that he is in fact the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing, you can have life, true life, in his name. And you might remember a few weeks ago, I told you about the first sign, where we turned water into wine, which in a way demonstrates Jesus' power over time, because he took something and he smashed it all together, because it's not that easy turning a grape into wine. That takes some time, that process, but he just did it instantly. And then last week we looked at that guy, that royal guy that had his son who was sick. And remember, Jesus healed his son from 20 miles away. And he demonstrates his power over distance. And I want you to pay attention, because as we go through the signs in John's gospel, you'll see how he demonstrates again and again his power over nature and over time, and it begins to help us see a story. And remember how we framed it, that we have all of these things that we might say are undeniables. That is, things about his character and his compassion and the way he treats people and his willingness to undergo suffering, and he didn't return an eye for an eye, and he cares about his wisdom in terms of responses on the spur of the moment. All of these things about Jesus that are just fabulous in any human being. Well, they're combined all the way through with these things that I want to call these unbelievables, because I'd never seen water turned into wine before. And these types of healings that he did. Well, I want to tell you about another one that went on here by the pool of Bethesda. And I asked myself, how did we end up that day, Jesus and the disciples, myself, at the pool? And I thought the answer is really basically pretty simple, is that Jesus wanted us to see the ghetto of Jerusalem. I mean, Bethesda was not really a Jewish hangout. I mean, Jewish people were there, but it was pagan in its background. And it was right there within eyesight of the temple where the pool was. And there was the temple, that you can see where the temple was here on the left-hand side. And that right just a little bit away from that, where there's this pagan pool, this pool of Bethesda. And so isn't it ironic that right there in the center of Jewish life and worship, we have this pool with this pagan history, where all of these folks that are invalids and people who are suffering and dirty and festering wounds and crying and groaning, and life's tragedies were all over them, and they were dependent on others to survive. They're within practically a stone's throw of the temple. And so it's in that setting where Jesus saw this begging man, this man who had been in his condition 38 years. And if you could appreciate that with me for just a moment, I mean, as one of Jesus' disciples, Jesus was just barely 30. All of us were in our early 30s. Here is this man that had been in this condition for longer than we had been alive. And Jesus asked him a very, very interesting and poignant question that it's been really haunting me all of my adult life. He asked him this in verse 6, and let's first put up our text. There it is. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked, "Do you want to get well?" Now, the reason I think it sort of haunts me as just a disturbing question is because why did Jesus ask him that? If somebody has been in their condition for 38 years, you would think the answer is so blatantly obvious that they want to get well that there is no point in Jesus asking the question, and yet he does. And it's interesting because in the Greek language, in the way when I wrote my book, I want you to see that it's even a little more strong. It's a little stronger than that. It says not just do you want to get well, but do you will? Is it in your will to get well? And so Jesus asked him this question, and while I said, it seems obvious, I think maybe there are areas in many of our lives where we're stuck. Anybody feel stuck? Where we're wallowing in our condition, and so I couldn't help but think about this man, particularly in light of his responses in verse 7. He says two things that are really quite curious, and let's put up verse 7 there. He says this, "Sir," the invalid replied, this is to Jesus, "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred." Now, I was blown away by this because here we were in the middle of God's great city, within a stone's throw of the Holy of Holies, where people from all over Israel make a pilgrimage to worship in that place. And this guy could say, "I've got no one to help me." He was alone in his suffering, or at least he thought so. And I wonder if, in fact, no one to help me, this idea of I'm all alone, was not just his challenge, but others feel it too. That it's me against the world, and the world is too big. Well, then he says a second thing that was somewhat or equally as astonishing. Then he says in the remainder of verse 7, "While I am trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me." In other words, the world is moving too fast for me, or I'm too slow, or I've been left behind. In either case, it sounds like he's making excuses, and yet this is his perception of the world around him. And this place, this pool that is supposed to help, has become a place of competition where others get in before him. And I suppose as one of Jesus' disciples, when I saw it, I think about this. There are winners of life and there are whiners. And this guy seems to me kind of like the whiner. That was my interpretation, at least at that point. And in my heart, I have to admit, I felt a bit sorry for the guy because he was so helpless. At the same time, I felt a bit disdain because he was such a victim. He had a victim mindset. And it seems as though there's something helpless in his outlook that was off-putting. What has happened to our society where we're filled with victims? And this man had a way of waiting life out, sitting and doing nothing. And I thought about the incredible contrast between him and the royal official of sign number 2, who got and said, "I'm going 20 miles to meet with this Jewish carpenter that I don't know anything about because I'm going to get some help." So it was just an interesting day of contrast. And I wanted to say to the guy, well, have some self-respect, man. And then just about as I'm thinking all this through, Jesus says, get up, take your mat and walk. And the guy grabs his mat and he walks off, and Jesus gives him this new life. And out of nowhere, grace shows up on the scene. And I realized again that I am with someone special. And here's what I mean by that. While most of the world is focused on harnessing the world's resources, we're trying to take our time and our energy and our money, and we're trying to make something out of it to sort of make the world work, right? Well, in the midst of all of that, that's how the pool worked. But the pool was pagan. It wasn't Jewish. It was pagan in the way it worked. And so stir the water a little bit and get in there and you'll get healed. Take the resources that we have and make something out of it. And the man couldn't seem to make it happen. But in the midst of that, God rains down his grace. Jesus is different. He doesn't harness the existing. He doesn't stir the water in the pool. He brings something new. He brings a resurrection force. And this is what we began to see as we walked with him again and again and again. And I think it raises one of the most important questions in all the world. And here's the question. Do I believe that heaven's resources can break in to my world? A lot of religious people really don't believe that. Even, in fact, a lot of Christian people might really doubt that. Well, I'd like to tell you that it all ended well there with the guy getting up, getting his mat and taking off. But here he is walking with his only possession. And the Pharisees see him. And they're going, like, what are you doing this on Sabbath for? Because here's what they are. They're legalist. They want to kill a good thing because of the way their religious convictions worked. And they don't inquire about his new life. And they see a problem, not a victory. Legalism becomes an enemy here. And in fact, everything turns on this. And the gospel, my gospel turns on this. Because when Jesus did that miracle on the Sabbath, from that point on, the Pharisees were determined to kill him. That's how upsetting it became. So it's an interesting text because the man who was miraculously healed, as he is now in the marketplace and the Pharisees ask him what's going on, he doesn't defend Jesus. He said, well, I don't really know what happened. I don't know who it was. He doesn't take even responsibility for being healed. He seems to, if I would put it in my words, seeks to avoid blame. He was saying, don't blame me that some guy comes along and makes me walk. He was physically healed, but spiritually, his poolside past was being dragged along. His sins and his problems and his sicknesses had become such a part of his identity that he was having trouble letting go, even though his legs now worked. Remember that line from Shawshank Redemption where Red, who was behind in prison for many, many years, says, these walls are funny. First you hate them. Why? Because you can't get out. There's no freedom. Then you get used to them. Enough time passes, you get so you depend on them. That's institutionalized. And I couldn't help but thinking how that happens to so many of us. But Jesus wasn't through with the man. He sought the man out because he knew there was something not right about the story. And so he goes into the marketplace and he finds the guy. And notice what he says in verse 14. Later, Jesus found him at the temple and said to him, see, you are well again. Stop sinning or something worse may happen to you. What a powerful address to this man who had just been extended grace. stop sinning or something. That was blunt. What was Jesus saying? Own up to who healed you. The sin of the man wasn't immorality. It wasn't a vice that he was stuck in. Here it was the sin. The sin was indifference or apathy or passivity to the one who had healed him. And I want you to see this in my gospel. This is all the way through it. If you'll bear with me just another minute or two, I want you to see how I bring this out in my gospel, in the Gospel of John. In John 9 and verse 41, after I've healed the man born blind, the Pharisees, and we're getting into it with the Pharisees, and this is what Jesus said to them. If you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains. What is he saying? What was Jesus saying to those Pharisees? He was saying to them, you are spiritually blind, and that is your sin. The same sin that the man in the marketplace had. Let's look at another passage in John 15. I'm trying to recount the story of how when Jesus addresses his disciples, how the world is going to hate them. And Jesus says to us, if I had not come and spoken to them, they would not be guilty of sin, but now they have no excuse for their sin. Why? Because I've come, because I've come in the flesh. Whoever hates me hates my Father as well. If I had not done among them the works no one else did, they would not be guilty of sin. What is the sin? The sin is unbelief. It is failing to trust in the Lord Jesus and see who he really is. It is they have seen, and yet they have hated both me and my Father. One other verse, John 16 and verse 9. You'll see it very clearly here. When he comes, this is the Holy Spirit. This is the reference here, the he. He will prove the world to be in the wrong about sin and righteousness and judgment. About sin because people do not believe in me. Sometimes we talk about sin as, sin is this and sin is that. We come up with here's sin. Here's our understanding of sin in John's gospel. It's a failure to put your trust in Jesus, who is the Messiah. And this was the man's problem, even after his legs had been healed. God works this grace from above, and yet the man was trapped in his unbelief. Now, let me just address each one of us for a moment. Like the man, haven't you received, as John's gospel, my gospel puts it, grace after grace? And yet, how many of us are stuck? Like the man, we cannot seem to shed the old habits, the old thinking, the old emotions, and we're dragging them into the present. Our unbelief, our failure to believe that there's resurrection power, that there's grace from above that can truly give life. So many of us are like, go ahead and put up our slide there of the hippos, are like these guys. Okay, we're like the man. Day after day, week after week, year after year, we're wallowing. We're wallowing. And I want to tell you, talk to you a little bit in my gospel about Chronos time. That is clock time. Seconds turn into minutes, turn into hours, turn into days, turn into weeks, turn into years. I want to tell you about my Lord. Through his grace, he brings Kairos time. Quality time. His time. For those who will choose by faith. So I want to challenge you to move beyond any passive indifference this morning and to choose life over determinism. It doesn't have to be. Your future is not determined by your past. That is a lie according to the gospel of God. Things can be different, and we can move from apathy and not give way to sin and unbelief. So Brad's going to come up here and lead us in a prayer as we close this morning. And he may have a couple of announcements, but I want this prayer to be on your heart. That the Lord, and maybe we just pray first, Brad, and then you can go to the announcements, but that the Lord will set you on fire through your gratefully receiving his powerful grace. It is creative. It is inbreaking. It is resurrection grace that is available to us who believe. Will you invite it into your heart today?